Good evening and welcome back once more to St Francis Vicarage here in Meath for the final part of our course on the background to the Old Testament. We're going to take a look tonight at the era around the end of the First Temple in Jerusalem and the exile as it's marked the end of an age and the birth pangs of a new one. And it is an appropriate point to cease, because at this point the Hebrew religion became more noticeably Jewish. There was a transformation, a transition between an earlier form of Hebraism and a later form. And we're going to be taking a quick look at the events that marked this, what brought it about, and a wee bit about the impact. We're going to look at the fall of Israel and the events that led up to it, and account for the continued survival of the southern kingdom of Judah for more than a century. And we'll also take a look at the events responsible for the conquest of Judah and the fall of Jerusalem. Look at the effect of the exile on Judah's relationship with God, and explain why this event was largely responsible for the transformation of the Hebrew people into what we would know more markedly as Judaism. It's not an absolute break, but it is a marked transition. We'll remind you that we're dealing with a culture which inhabited and developed in the Promised Land for some centuries. The exact dates and career of Moses are still debated. It's a typical thing with ancient history, with early history. Assigning accurate dates is always a difficult task, and very often you'll get quite a wide variation in dates. For very good reasons, it's not always easy to get even a century. We also consider the fact that this development was always in tension and relationship with other regional cultures. Sometimes it was in a productive fashion and sometimes it wasn't. And Israel always had to struggle to maintain its separate identity, and in particular its religious distinctiveness against bigger and more powerful neighbours. And it wasn't even just external problems, even within the state itself. Yahwehism was not always widely accepted. Now, I think we have to start by reminding ourselves that the early Hebrew invaders of the land of Canaan, the Promised Land, didn't succeed at once in driving out or exterminating the earlier inhabitants. They were engaged in a few centuries of intermittent warfare and assimilation. The biblical record highlights in many places the successes of the Israelite people, but it's not hard to see that these successes were marked by setbacks, by failures to conquer territory, by trying to assimilate people they couldn't drive out or exterminate. Now, the age of David, I suppose, without doubt, Israel's greatest king, and his son Solomon the Wise, although the end of his kingdom betrayed the fact that perhaps he wasn't as wise as he thought. This period saw Israel develop into a regional power, controlling what was in effect a small empire. That, however, was not due solely to the prowess of the Hebrews, but as much as that to the relative weakness of the other regional powers. Events came together at this point in time that made it easier for the new kingdom to rise to some sort of local prominence. There was distraction, there were political and military setbacks for its neighbours. So, into what was a relative vacuum, Israel found a place to step. And this was particularly true of both Egypt and the Philistine coastal city states. And we remember that Israel controlled the highlands, but the Philistines were on the coast, and it took some time and some periods of warfare and diplomacy as well to bring those under the sway of Israel, if not under their direct control. Now, in the east, particularly Assyria, was experiencing a sharp decline in its fortunes at this time. It did pick up, but it had a sort of lull in its influence and power around this time, which greatly helped David and Solomon in their expansionism. Israel's economy, particularly under Solomon, thrived as he made full use of his control of the land bridge between Egypt, regional superpower, and Syria, which was really the gateway to the east. One of the major sources of his revenue was the export trade in Egyptian chariots and horses. They had to pass through his kingdom to get to the market they were headed for. He would levy tolls and did quite well out of it, as well as his ships based at the seaport of Etzion Geber on the shores of the Red Sea, using largely Phoenician sailors, likewise engaged in very profitable trading activities. Even they probably reached India, I think that's fairly certain, and arguably, although it is very arguably, as far as China. And there are claims that Phoenician sailors in his employ circumnavigated Africa, although the known dates would indicate this is unlikely, even though technically possible. It's perhaps some centuries later when that actually took place. However, although Solomon was rich, his wealth couldn't support his army, his vast building program, his chariot cities, his harem, the court, and so on. And it caused a crisis in the financial affairs of the state. So he had to resort to the hated corvée, or manpower levy, as was compulsory, effectively slave labour imposed upon the people. They would have to donate willingly or otherwise their labour to help build the king's chariot cities, his citadels, his fortresses. And this caused considerable tensions, and this came to a head under his son Rehoboam. Now, due to his inflexibility, and with a bit of leeway, it could probably have been sorted out. Unfortunately, Rehoboam lacked the wisdom of his father, certainly his father in his younger day, and came under the influence of some friends who were perhaps a bit hot-headed, a bit young, not given to working out a diplomatic solution. Now, due to his inflexibility, that's Rehoboam's, the 10 northern tribes split from Judah, and the king, and they based at Shechem, which was to the north of Jerusalem, and you can find that on a good biblical map that are easily available on the internet. Based at Shechem, they set about establishing their own independent monarchy. So from this point, the dual monarchy was over, and you had two kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And the Old Testament writers are generally based in Judah and Jerusalem, and as a result, they were usually hostile to Israel. And it's alas perhaps almost entirely through their lenses that we can view the northern kingdom. Now, although the north continued in its worship of Yahweh, they set up a rival temple to Jerusalem. Now, you must remember that under David, worship was centralized in the royal shrines. David himself had planned or wanted to build a house, a temple for God in Jerusalem, and bought the land on which it was going to be built. But God said this was for Solomon to do. David did preparations, laid in stocks and materials, but it was his son Solomon who built this temple and centralized the worship for the community, sacrificial worship, on that temple in Jerusalem. And what you have now is Israel setting up its own show, a rival temple, a temple where the northern tribes could meet and worship God, have their allegiance. Now, the southern writers rarely missed a chance in denouncing Israel's supposed backsliding and betrayal of Yahweh, although whether that was entirely justifiable is open to considerable debate. You must remember that in both the north and the south there were considerable anti-Yahwehistic influences still at work. People tried to sit alongside their worship of Yahweh, rather hedge their bets. They would worship local deities perhaps of foreign wives, and this is condemned numerous times in the scriptures. Now, as a separate kingdom, Israel pursued its own foreign policy. In the face of the utter collapse of the Davidic and Solomonic Empire, the empire went virtually overnight, and you had a new situation. Now, the muddled political situation, the plotting and scheming, brought Israel into very sharp conflict, particularly with Egypt, under their pharaoh Shishak. And Egypt then invaded Israel, shattering much of its prosperity and doing untold damage to the kingdom. Israel was never to be the same again. It seems that Judah was kept out, of that conflict. We don't find Shishak actually invading Judah, but the northern kingdom came under sustained attack. However, Egypt was no longer powerful enough to sustain its campaign, and full conquest of the region was no longer for Egypt a possibility, although they probably wanted to reclaim their Asiatic empire. They weren't no longer strong enough. Further localized war, however, and war with other neighbors, drained Israel yet further. It cost money, it cost lives, it cost territory. Now, religious strife as well compounded Israel's problems. And if you read the book of Prophet Amos, the earliest of the prophetic writers whose writings we have, you'll find that Amos saw the betrayal of Yahweh in both cultic and especially moral forms call down upon God's judgment and retribution. Israel is condemned because they break Yahweh's law, particularly in the treatment of the poor, the landless, and the oppressed. And to cut a long story short, and it is a complicated story, it came as no surprise, certainly not to the likes of Amos, when Israel fell foul of a resurgent an increasingly aggressive Assyria. And finally, Israel fell in 722 BC. And what happened with the population? Much of it was deported. It's a standard Assyrian military policy. You take away the population, you spread them through the empire, they become assimilated with the other peoples, and the political and military threat that they posed is negated. And this happened to the people of Israel, thus bringing about the loss of the 10 northern tribes. And these became, known as the lost tribes of Israel. They would have just melted into the general background population of the Assyrian Empire, and that's all we hear of them. Now, primarily by keeping at least outwardly loyal to their Assyrian overlord, paying tribute, by refusing to join rebellious activity incited by their neighbours, the southern kingdom of Judah was able to maintain a degree of security and independence. It was a degree, although there were always those who sought greater freedom from the state. Religious tensions, not least over a seeming failure by God to protect his people, led to further disturbance, and especially as royal policy was not always favourable to the promotion of the cause of Yahweh. They may pay lip service, but they worship other gods. Their understanding of God's law was deficient, and so on. This brought considerable religious tensions, open conflict, even internecine warfare within the kingdom of Judah. And it was constantly decried by the prophets, who were always trying to recall Israel to the pure worship of God. Now, by performing a delicate balancing act, Judah was able to stagger on from one crisis to another, the next, losing bits of territory here and bits of territory there. The state becomes smaller and weaker and poorer. But finally, disaster fell in 582, when, following a rebellion by the Hebrew people, Jerusalem was seized by the Babylonians, who were the successors to Assyria as the regional bully boy. And again, most of the people, at least of the upper and middle classes, were deported to Babylon, and Judah was finished. That was the end of the southern kingdom. It never again regained proper independence, save for a few years later on, and even that was marked by conflict. It was marked by the threat of assimilation, which finally came true. But for now, and definitively, both Judah and Israel are gone. Jewish independence, a thing of the past. Now, exile, however traumatic for the Hebrew people, and the Bible makes it clear that it was traumatic. And if you want to see, I suppose, something of the psyche of the people of Judah who were taken away captive into exile, read Psalm 127. And although this was traumatic, ultimately, although it couldn't be seen at the time, it was hugely beneficial for the development of the Hebrew faith. Not only did these events force upon them a radical rethinking of their vision of their relationship with God, it brought them back to an equally radical understanding of what that relationship meant to them. Moreover, the destruction of the temple forced them into a situation in which no sacrifice was possible. Sacrifice, and therefore being made right with God, for only sacrifice could do that, was only possible, it was believed, in the temple in Jerusalem, where God had chosen to make his home. The presence of God, the Shekinah, dwelt there. And without the temple, no sacrifice, no forgiveness. Now, in the early stages, in the middle stages of this exile, they could see no chance of them returning. So they had to either assimilate entirely into the surrounding culture, or they had to keep some sort of distinctiveness. Now, this was helped by the policy of settlement, which saw them settled in groups, in towns, in community together, making the maintenance of their distinctiveness a bit easier. Now, this period then necessitated the birth of the synagogue. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the synagogue and a lot of debate about its role, and in both in exile and later. I think the thing to remember is that the synagogue was not a replacement for the temple. It wasn't a case of we can no longer have the temple. We'll have a synagogue, and the synagogue will take the place of the temple. No, the temple could not be replaced. Therefore, the synagogue was something different. It wasn't so much a house of prayer, although obviously prayer did take place in them. It was a place of instruction. It was a community resource, rather like in this country today, for example, Sikhs, Muslims have their own places of worship. But they don't replace the central places, for instance, the Golden Temple at Amritsar, the shrines at Medina, and although the parallel is not exact because these places can still be visited when the temple could not, nevertheless, the synagogue was something new, not a replacement, but new. And it was to have an enduring place within what was developing into Judaism. So much so that when there was a return to Israel, they took the synagogue with them. And even when the temple had been rebuilt, there was still, especially outside Jerusalem, but also within it, an enduring place for the synagogue. And we can see mention of that quite clearly in the book of the Acts in the first Christian century. Now, the theological responses to the fall of Jerusalem and the ending of the Davidic kingship created a rich theology centered on the nature of the covenant and also on the ideas of God being faithful, and the remnant would be restored to Jerusalem. And after a period of some 70 years, political circumstances had changed, and the new Persian rulers of Babylon permitted the Jews, as they were now known, to return to Judah to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, though remaining, of course, under Persian control. They were at most a province of the Persian Empire, although even that is open to a lot of debate. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah in particular provide us with a fascinating picture of the difficulties of this period. Only a portion of the people returned, and that itself created a crisis, particularly in the third Isaiah. In Ezekiel, we find great hope, great expectation that the whole people would return to the promised land. And it didn't happen. They thought that on their return, everything would be hunky-dory. They would build up the temple. They would re-establish some measure of independence at least. No, not easily. They did rebuild the temple. They did rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but it was in the teeth of opposition. Nehemiah makes clear particularly about the opposition to them from those who had remained in the land, who had seen themselves as the inheritors of the promises of God to the people. And when the new people arrived back from their exile, their faith had developed and changed. There wasn't always agreement between those who had remained in the land, those who had been forced into exile. Now, most of the people who remained behind, who didn't return to the Holy Land, they didn't go on so much as to merge into the surrounding culture. They maintained their distinctiveness, their own identity. But they created enduring Jewish communities, which have lasted, if not to this day, until very recently. The wars in the Middle East over the last 20 years or so have had an impact on both Christianity and what remains of Judaism there. But for many, many centuries, for millennia, there were large Jewish communities in these ancient lands that hadn't come back, but nevertheless remained faithful to Judaism, and they worked creatively what was in their past traditions, and assimilated other ideas. And the idea of life after death comes largely from this context, as well as by deep reflection on the future. The Jews came to develop their religion in new, perhaps unexpected ways, culminating most profoundly in the gradual development of the idea of God's acting in human history in a new way. He always acted, but this was to be in a new way through the advent of the Messiah. And it's quite interesting that in the very first Christian generations, we find the apostles not so much heading into the West. We're all familiar with Paul, Peter, at work in the Roman Empire, Andrew, John. Other apostles, other disciples went east to these large Jewish communities, which they attempted to evangelize with some success. Because as well as being home to ancient Jewish communities, these lands are home to ancient Christian churches, which arose largely out of the Jewish communities that existed before them, some of whom accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Now, this brings our course on the background to the Old Testament to a conclusion. It has, by its very nature, been something of a picture painted with very broad brushstrokes, but which has provided, I hope at the very least, some ideas that the fact that the Old Testament didn't drop out of the sky, but was heavily influenced by its surroundings, by historical events, and by prevailing developments within cultures. That does not in any sense mean that God did not write it. The writers of the scriptures wrote what the Holy Spirit gave them to write, but they did it within a context or contexts. Now, there's a huge number of books which deal with these concepts. You'll see some of them behind me, just a few. I'm not primarily an Old Testament scholar, but I hope this course has inspired you, if not to read the books themselves, at least to be open to reading the Old Testament in a new light. aware of its culture, aware of its development, aware of the interactions that were going on in this period that was many centuries, perhaps 1,000 years long. Now, please keep an eye out for further courses and videos on this channel. And of course, keep an eye on our Facebook page and a church near you. And we hope to develop a new website, and that's proving a bit more difficult than we'd anticipated. We hope to be streaming on this channel some worship soon. We're sorting out some technical problems, but that should be manageable very shortly. So thank you for joining us. Goodbye for now. May Almighty God bless you through this Advent when we look for the Messiah who has come to come again with power and great glory. And may God bless you and keep you safe through this coming Christmas season. Thank you.